For more than 50 years, Ringo Starr let the world believe a comfortable story. The Beatles broke up over money. That was the line everyone repeated. But now, at 85, Ringo has decided to stop protecting that version. He says the truth was simpler and far more uncomfortable. Four young men who once felt like brothers slowly stopped getting along. There were rows. There was a night he walked out of the studio completely. And there was one betrayal so close to home that even John Lennon struggled to find words for it. Ringo is finally ready to talk. Richard Starkey came into the world on July 7, 1940, in a cramped two-story house on Madron Street in the Dingle, one of Liverpool's roughest districts. The streets carried the scars of wartime bombing. Jobs were scarce. Homes were crowded. Many families lived without hot running water, and small comforts were rare. When Richard was only 3, his father walked away, leaving his mother Elsie to raise him alone on very little. That was the world that formed him. It was hard, worn down, and unforgiving. Yet inside that forgotten corner of Liverpool, the story of the future Ringo Starr had already begun. His childhood became even harder in 1947, when he was only 6 years old. His appendix burst without warning, and the infection spread through his body so badly that he fell into a coma for several days. Elsie stayed by his side at Myrtle Street Children's Hospital, while doctors warned her again and again that her son might not survive the night. Somehow, he held on. Even after that, the danger passed slowly. Recovery took a full year, and his 7th birthday came not at home with friends, but in a hospital bed with nurses around him. Before he had even reached the age when most children begin to feel steady in the world, life had already taught him pain, fear, and long stretches of loneliness. Then, just when he was trying to catch up, illness found him again. In 1953, at 13, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis and sent away to a sanatorium. Treatment meant long months in bed, heavy doses of streptomycin, and more lost time while other children moved ahead with their lives. He later remembered spending his 14th birthday there, still shut away from the outside world. When both hospital stays were added together, along with several bouts of pleurisy, he had spent around 3 years inside medical institutions before turning 15. Those years changed everything. School slipped away from him. Reading became difficult. Basic arithmetic never settled into place. Shame followed quietly behind him, and for a long time he hardly spoke about how much of his education had simply vanished. Yet inside that bleak chapter, something unexpected happened. During his stay in the sanatorium, a music teacher came through the children's ward carrying a basket of simple instruments. She handed them out one by one. Someone got maracas. Someone got a tambourine. Ringo got a small drum. The moment he struck it, something lit up inside him. He later said that from that instant, all he wanted was to be a drummer. He had no proper sticks, so he improvised, pulling cotton from cardboard holders and beating on his locker and bed frame. It was a tiny beginning, almost laughably small, but that little drum gave direction to a boy whose life had so often been shaped by sickness and waiting. By the time music started to pull him forward, he had already learned how fragile life could feel, and maybe that is part of what gave him his stubbornness. Before he ever became a Beatle, he built his reputation with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. In Liverpool around 1960, that band stood higher than the Beatles. Rory Storm was flashy, wild, and impossible to ignore, and the Hurricanes were a major local draw. Ringo, still a teenager, joined them in 1959 and committed himself fully to music. At that point, the Beatles were still on the rise. The strange twist is clear now. The group he had not joined yet would soon become the most famous band the world had ever seen. That shift began to take shape in Hamburg. In 1960, both Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and the Beatles ended up there for brutal club residencies. The glamour people imagine now was nowhere in sight. The hours were punishing. The nights were endless. Bands played for huge stretches of time, often into the early morning, in rough clubs filled with noise, smoke, and exhaustion. Ringo and the Beatles were not just passing acquaintances in that setting. They were young musicians surviving the same grind together. That shared pressure mattered. Night after night, in that hard world of the Reeperbahn, friendship formed in a real way. And the connection went deeper than most people realize. On October 15, 1960, while still in Hamburg, Ringo played in a recording session with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, along with Hurricanes bassist Lou Walters. Pete Best, who was then the Beatles' drummer, was not there. So long before Ringo officially joined the band, he was already stepping into their circle. He was not an outsider waiting at the edge. He was already close enough to fit the shape of the group. That is why his arrival in the Beatles in 1962 did not happen by accident. When producer George Martin and manager Brian Epstein began to feel that Pete Best was not right for the future of the band in the studio, John, Paul, and George already knew who they wanted. They wanted Ringo. He was a stronger drummer, but that alone was not the whole reason. He also matched their humor, their rhythm as people, the strange mix of dryness and warmth that held them together. Epstein went to ask him directly, while he was still touring with Rory Storm at Butlin's holiday camp in Skegness. Ringo agreed immediately. On August 18, 1962, he became a Beatle. Even then, the change did not come with an easy welcome. Pete Best had a loyal following, and many fans were furious when he was fired. The anger spilled straight into public view. At the Cavern Club, crowds chanted against Ringo. On his very first appearance there as an official Beatle, George Harrison was punched in the eye by an angry fan. So Ringo's first steps into the band that would change music did not begin with applause alone. They began with tension, noise, and resistance. Then came the speed of Beatlemania, and that kind of rise can make even a strong person feel unsteady. On February 9, 1964, the Beatles played The Ed Sullivan Show for an audience of around 73 million people. It was one of the most famous television appearances in history. America was watching. The country seemed to stop for them. Yet for Ringo, the moment carried a quieter emotional weight. He had only joined the band 18 months earlier. He had stepped into a machine that was already moving fast, and now suddenly the whole world was staring. On the surface, it was thrilling. Underneath, there was still uncertainty. He was standing at the center of a cultural storm, and part of him was still wondering where exactly he stood with the other three. That feeling followed him even into triumph. At Shea Stadium on August 15, 1965, the Beatles played before 55,600 fans, setting a new record for the largest rock concert of its kind. The screaming was so loud that the band could barely hear the music. For Ringo, the solution was strangely practical. He watched the movements of John, Paul, and George on stage and used their bodies as visual cues to stay locked into the performance. One of the biggest shows in rock history, held together because the drummer learned to read motion when sound failed him. Yet, the deeper the Beatles went into fame, the more complicated Ringo's place inside the band became. Out of the group's 213 officially recorded songs, he received only 2 songwriting credits, Don't Pass Me By and Octopus's Garden. He was loved by fans, especially in America, where his male reportedly outpaced the others at one point. But popularity did not bring creative power. He was central to the sound and yet often left outside the core decisions. He gave the band steadiness, warmth, and character, but the inner circle of songwriting still revolved mainly around Lennon and McCartney, with Harrison fighting for room of his own as well. The strain across the band showed up in other ways too. In 1965, all four Beatles received the MBE from Queen Elizabeth II, and what should have felt like a shared honor quickly became part of a larger tension around identity, status, and control. A few years later, when John Lennon returned his own medal without consulting the others, the move carried more than political meaning. It showed how far the sense of acting as one unit had begun to slip. That same drifting feeling haunted their final years together. By the time the touring years ended at Candlestick Park on August 29, 1966, the structure that had kept them moving as one group was already weakening. The final concert lasted only about half an hour. Seats sat empty. When it ended, they were rushed out and taken away almost immediately. The moment passed so quickly that few people present understood they were witnessing the last Beatles concert. For Ringo, there was relief in no longer facing the chaos of touring. At the same time, something important disappeared. The road had forced four very different men into the same routine. Without it, distance had more room to grow. That distance became even clearer in the studio years. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, recorded between late 1966 and April 1967, took around 700 hours to complete. Just 4 years earlier, the Beatles had recorded their debut album in roughly 10 hours in a single day. The difference says everything. They were no longer a live band capturing energy quickly. They had become studio perfectionists, building and reshaping songs piece by piece. The results were extraordinary, but the process also revealed how much the group had changed. Endless time in the studio made brilliance possible, yet it also gave every unresolved tension more space to settle in. George Harrison felt that pressure deeply. He was a gifted songwriter, but within the Beatles he was often allowed only 1 or 2 songs per album. The frustration built year after year. When he finally stepped outside the band and released All Things Must Pass, the size of the backlog told its own story. These were not sudden songs. They were years of being held back. Even While My Guitar Gently Weeps, now seen as one of his great achievements, struggled to earn proper attention until Eric Clapton came in to play on it. The pattern inside the band was becoming clear. Great talent could exist in full view and still go half-heard. Ringo knew that feeling in his own way. Don't Pass Me By was one of the few songs he got to bring through, and even that had been waiting in the wings for years before it was finally recorded for the White Album. Imagine carrying a song that long and watching it remain on the side while history moved around you. He was essential to the group, and yet often treated as if creativity belonged elsewhere. All of this fed into the White Album sessions in 1968, where the tensions inside the Beatles became impossible to ignore. The band had just returned from India, where they had gone to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. That trip, which began with hope, ended in confusion and distrust. They came home already fractured, then walked straight into months of recording that felt less like one band making one record and more like 4 separate artists working under the same name. Paul McCartney later called it the Tension Album, and that description fits. The sessions stretched from May to October 1968. Many tracks were built in pieces, often with only some of the Beatles present. Sometimes they were barely functioning as a full group at all. Under that strain, Ringo finally reached his limit. On August 22, 1968, during the White Album sessions, he walked out. The break came during work on Back in the USSR. After growing frustration, and a sense that he no longer fit comfortably in the room. When he told the others he was leaving, the responses were strangely revealing. Each Beatle, in his own way, seemed to feel like the outsider. That detail matters because it shows how deeply the disconnect had spread. This was not one man breaking away from three united companions. It was four people standing close together, while privately feeling alone. Ringo escaped to Sardinia with his family and spent time on Peter Sellers' yacht. There, away from the tension, a small moment turned into a song. After hearing about how octopuses collect shiny things and build spaces for themselves under the sea, he began imagining a peaceful place far from the chaos around him. That image would later become Octopus's Garden. It is easy to hear the song as playful, and it is, but its root lies in something more tender. He wanted rest. He wanted shelter. He wanted a place that felt calm. What finally broke the Beatles was not one dramatic moment. It was a slow wearing down that happened in front of cameras, inside meetings, and later inside courtrooms. By January 1969, the band had started what was meant to be a fresh beginning. The project was first called Get Back, and the idea sounded hopeful. They would leave behind Studio Polish, play live again, and look like a real band working together. Instead, when filming began at Twickenham Film Studios in January 1969, the cameras caught a group already coming apart. Paul McCartney was openly telling George Harrison how to play guitar parts, and the mood kept getting worse. Harrison later said in a 1987 interview with Musician magazine that he had become fed up with the bad vibes, especially because his arguments with Paul were being captured on film. So, within a week, the project that was supposed to bring them back to basics was already exposing how badly things had soured. That tension soon turned into something harder to ignore. On January 10, 1969, after a morning session at Twickenham, George Harrison stood up and quit. The way he recorded it later that day made the whole thing feel even colder. In his diary, he wrote, "Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home. Then he went to Trident Studio, recorded music, and later had chips with friends. It was such a huge moment in rock history. Yet he moved through the evening as if life had simply taken a sharp turn and kept going." 5 days later, Harrison came back, but only after setting clear conditions. The sessions had to move from Twickenham to Apple Studios. The live concert idea had to go. The way they worked together had to change. They agreed, and from that point on, the Beatles never returned to Twickenham. Even after that, the project still had one last strange burst of life. On January 30th, 1969, the Beatles climbed onto the roof of Apple Corps at 3 Savile Row for a concert that had no tickets, no announcement, and no normal audience. It was chaotic from the start. Ringo Starr had to be coaxed into taking part only minutes before they went up there. Still, once they began, the energy was real. For 42 minutes, they played 10 songs, including Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, and I've Got a Feeling. The Metropolitan Police, whose station was on the same street, eventually warned Apple they had 10 minutes before the show had to stop. Officers ended up standing behind the band while they were still playing. Then the performance was shut down, and John Lennon closed the moment with one of the most famous final lines in music history. He said, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group. I hope we pass the audition." It sounded funny. It also sounded like the end. Behind the scenes, money was making everything worse. After manager Brian Epstein died in August 1967, Apple Corps began bleeding cash, and the band badly needed direction. In early 1969, they held a vote over who should manage their business affairs. John Lennon supported Alan Klein, partly because Klein had impressed him by quoting Lennon's own lyrics back to him word for word. George Harrison and Ringo Starr backed John. Paul McCartney stood alone. He wanted Lee Eastman, his future father-in-law. The other three did not trust that arrangement because they believed Eastman would lean toward Paul in every major decision. For a short time, both Klein and Eastman were working around Apple at once, which only made matters worse. Later, even Lennon, Harrison, and Starr turned on Klein too, and he was eventually bought out of Apple with a multi-million-dollar settlement. By then, the damage had already been done. Business had stopped being a support system and had become another source of division. Then came the final insult for Paul. By April 1970, he was so cut off from the others that he was not involved in the last mixing sessions for Let It Be. Without asking him, John Lennon brought in Phil Spector. On April 1st and 2nd, 1970, Spector went into Room 4 at Abbey Road and added orchestral overdubs, a women's choir, and harps to The Long and Winding Road. For McCartney, that song was deeply personal. He did not hear about the changes in a meeting. He received a finished copy in the mail. Shocked and angry, he wrote to Alan Klein with 4 demands. The final one was simple and sharp. Don't do it again. None of his demands were respected. The altered version came out anyway. Then, on December 31st, 1970, McCartney filed suit in the High Court of Justice in London to dissolve the Beatles as a legal partnership. The formal end came later, on December 29, 1974, but the break had already become irreversible. While the band was falling apart, Ringo Starr was trying to build a life that looked steadier than the others. He married Maureen Cox on February 11, 1965, in a quiet ceremony at Caxton Hall Register Office in London. Beatlemania was exploding outside, but the wedding itself was small and almost secret. He was 24. She was 18. Over the next few years, they had 3 children. Zach, born September 13, 1965, Jason, born August 19, 1967, and Lee, born November 11, 1970. From the outside, Ringo seemed to have the most settled home life of any Beatle. Yet under that surface, the strain was already growing. The collapse of the Beatles left him facing a new identity. And in the early 1970s, that inner confusion would become far more destructive. One of the worst blows came from someone he trusted. Around 1973, George Harrison began an affair with Maureen Starkey. The relationship was later confirmed in Philip Norman's biography, George Harrison, The Reluctant Beatle. Maureen would visit Harrison's Friar Park estate late at night, supposedly to hear him working in the studio, and stay until morning. The situation became impossible to hide, and then it became impossible to forget. During a dinner at Tittenhurst Park, Ringo and Maureen's own home, George reportedly looked at Ringo and said, "I'm in love with your wife." Ringo was stunned. After a long silence, he replied, "Better you than someone we don't know." John Lennon later described the whole mess as virtual incest. That phrase stayed with people because it captured how painfully tangled the band's personal lives had become. The affair did not just wound one marriage. It tore through 2 families at once. Pattie Boyd, who was married to George at the time, later described it as the moment everything collapsed. She remembered walking in on Maureen at Friar Park and being told by George that she was just having a rest. Boyd later wrote, "She was the last person I would have expected to stab me in the back." Ringo and Maureen divorced on July 17, 1975, with a reported settlement of $500,000. George and Pattie divorced in 1977. What had once looked like a close circle of friends had turned into something painful and broken. For Ringo, that loss opened the door to a much darker period. After the divorce, he spiraled into heavy drinking and serious drug use that lasted for years. He later admitted, "Some of those years are absolutely gone. I was drunk." Doctors at the rehab center he eventually entered found liver damage and an enlarged heart caused by sustained alcohol abuse. Through much of the 1970s and 1980s, he barely toured. That was not because he had stepped back by choice. It was because he was too intoxicated to function reliably. He even confessed that part of him feared sobriety because he did not know how he could play without alcohol. He once said, "I don't know how you do anything if you're not drunk." That belief kept him trapped far longer than he should have been. Then, in 1980, his life changed again. While filming the comedy Caveman, he met American actress Barbara Bach, who was widely known for playing Anya Amasova in the 1977 Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me. Their relationship moved quickly, and almost as quickly, it was tested by disaster. On May 19, 1980, while driving at around 60 miles per hour on the A3 near Surrey in dense fog, Ringo swerved to avoid a lorry. His white Mercedes skidded for about 50 yards and smashed head-on into two lampposts. He injured his leg, but still pulled Barbara from the wreckage. Then, in a detail that feels bizarre and very human at the same time, he climbed back into the ruined car to get his cigarettes. 3 weeks later, Barbara told her father she was going to marry him. They wed on April 27, 1981, at Marylebone Town Hall, and both Paul McCartney and George Harrison attended the reception. In 1988, Ringo and Barbara entered the Sierra Tucson Rehabilitation Clinic in Arizona together and got sober side by side. By 2025, Ringo had marked 37 years of sobriety, and their relationship had lasted more than 44 years. That recovery matters even more when you look at how far he had fallen after the Beatles. In 1973, Ringo released the album Ringo, and briefly became the most commercially successful former Beatle. It was a surprise to almost everyone. The album produced 2 back-to-back #1 singles in the United States: Photograph, which he co-wrote with George Harrison, and You're 16, a cover of the 1960 Johnny Burnett hit. What made the album historic was that all 4 Beatles contributed to it in some form after the breakup. Paul, George, and John all took part, though not at the same time, making it the only solo album from the post-Beatles era to feature involvement from every member of the band. But that high point did not last. By 1977 and 1978, Ringo's career had crashed hard. Ringo IV and Bad Boy were both critical and commercial failures. They barely charted, and the industry had little reason to keep pushing them. The decline was tied closely to his addiction. He was arriving at sessions drunk, unfocused, and unreliable. Cocaine use deepened the problem. In only a few years, he had gone from major solo success to creative collapse. It happened fast, and it happened in public. The personal cost was even worse. Ringo later admitted that whole stretches of the late 1970s and 1980s were simply missing from his memory. He did not describe them as blurry. He described them as gone. In July 2025, at age 85, while marking 37 years of sobriety, he again said that some of those years had completely disappeared because of alcohol. He could not clearly remember recording sessions, conversations, or major moments in his own life. Barbara Bach was drinking heavily too, and together they were moving closer to disaster in almost every part of their lives. The turning point came in rehab in 1988. Ringo and Barbara entered a 5-week program together. He later said that for the first 8 days, he was not truly committed. Then something changed. 8 days in, I decided, I'm here to get help because I know I'm sick. From there, he stopped resisting and started listening. He said he followed what they told him to do and that it pulled him through. Looking back, he has treated that decision as the most important one he ever made. Sobriety also gave him back his music. When he left rehab in early 1989, he still had doubts. His own lawyer had to convince him to return to the stage after hearing from a group of major musicians who wanted to tour with him. That lineup would become the first all-star band, and it included Joe Walsh, Levon Helm, Clarence Clemens, Billy Preston, and Rick Danko. Ringo's response at first was full of fear and disbelief. He said, "I didn't think anybody would come. I only knew 3 drummers, and I was one of them." He also worried that he would not know how to perform sober because alcohol had been part of his routine for so long. Yet, he did it. That tour helped save him, and it even inspired others. Dr. John later said Ringo's sobriety on that run helped push him to get clean on December 17, 1989, a day he called his birthday, until he died in 2019. When that first tour ended, 5 of the 9 musicians involved had entered rehab. Years later, Ringo also became one of the clearest voices about what really happened inside the Beatles. For a long time, people leaned on the easier story that business disagreements had broken the band. Then Ringo sat down with Dan Rather on The Big Interview and said something much more direct. "We didn't get along. We were 4 guys. We had rows." That mattered because it cut through decades of careful spin. Still, he did not say the music was fake or forced. He said that once the count-in began, they gave their best. So, in his view, the relationships were damaged, but the work still had truth in it. He has also described the end of the band not as one explosion, but as a slow draining away. The period from 1968 to 1969, covering the White Album, Let It Be, and Abbey Road, was when he felt the spirit changing. The tension kept building. At one point, during the White Album sessions in August 1968, Ringo himself walked out. He returned 2 weeks later and found his drum kit covered in flowers by the other 3. It was a kind gesture. It also showed that affection was still there, even while the structure around them was weakening. That is why Ringo often talks about the Beatles as brothers. He has been careful with that word. Brothers fight. Brothers hurt each other. Brothers can still love each other. He has returned to that idea many times because it lets him speak honestly about the conflict without reducing everything to bitterness. Even John Lennon, who could be the harshest in the early 1970s, still remained connected to the others in ways that never fully disappeared. Ringo seems to have made peace with that contradiction. He does not need the Beatles' story to be neat. He accepts that it was powerful, messy, creative, painful, and deeply human all at once. He has also pointed to one missing piece that might have changed everything. In his view, the Beatles could possibly have survived if they had found the right manager after Brian Epstein died in August 1967 at the age of 32 from an accidental drug overdose. Without Epstein, there was no trusted figure holding the center. Apple Corps, launched in 1968, became a financial mess and then a battlefield. Ringo believes that if all 4 Beatles had agreed on one strong manager, much of the business chaos that fed their resentment might have been avoided. In that sense, the band was not only undone by ego or personal conflict, it was also undone by a vacuum that nobody knew how to fill. By the time Ringo turned 85 on July 7, 2025, he was looking back from a very different place. For years, he has marked his birthday with his Peace and Love campaign, asking people around the world to pause at noon local time and say or think the words peace and love. By 2025, the message had reached 38 countries, and he even arranged for it to be shared with astronauts aboard the International Space Station. He does not speak about the Beatles with the old edge anymore. He has lived through addiction, recovery, illness, loss, and the deaths of John Lennon in 1980 and George Harrison in 2001. Now, when he says he feels lucky, it does not sound like a line. It sounds earned